Hello and good evening to everyone. I am Vanessa with the Historical Society of Frankford, Secretary, and on behalf of all of us, I would like to joyfully welcome you to our holiday season lecture. Please do stick around afterwards, as Santa often tends to swing by, and he helps us pass around the donation hat as well as provides some lovely good cheer. Speaking of such, if you donate through our website, at the purchases section, you can choose from a couple of lovely books as a gift for your donation. Also, memberships make lovely gifts. So tonight's speaker is Gail McCormick, retired librarian and archivist, who is currently completing a book manuscript documenting the 150-year history of the New Jerusalem Society of Frankford, also known as Swedenborgian, where her grandmother, Marion Lieber Smith, was a fourth-generation member. And for this presentation, she will share memories of Christmas past discovered in her research. Thanks so much and enjoy.
Probably hear Vanessa as she was telling the online audience, but just to give you a little background about myself, I'm a retired librarian and archivist. I was a decade librarian at the Historical Society of Washington, D.C., so I understand this sort of collection. My current research, though, is based on my family history, and originally this presentation was going to be a broader description of my 50-year project documenting the history of the New Jerusalem Church, Swedenborgian Church in Frankfurt. But we discovered, Susan discovered some very interesting artifacts in the collection here that we thought would be worth preserving, organizing, perhaps putting together into an exhibit and postpone that till later. So I said I would think about this as a first kind of a Christmas stocking, reaching deep into a several hundred-page manuscript to find some shiny objects that had something to do with both the history of the church, Frankfurt, and the holidays. On this particular slide, this is the church as it exists today on Paul Street. It's now the Moses Holy Temple Church, and Reverend Kidd graciously invited my husband and myself in to take a look, to talk to him about the programs that he's doing there now, and I hope he'll be with us when we do the broader story about the church. But this particular, in reaching into my Christmas stocking, I found the particular quote that's on the screen right now. It was a melancholy quote post-Civil War, but it was a time when religion was more fluid, and whereas many people sitting here today might say, well, I don't really know, what is Swedenborgianism? But people then would have understood what that meant, that Christmas makes us Swedenborgians. And if you're a historian, you can also recognize the thought in this. The lost sit with us and walk and play and chasten with indescribable serenity the universal joy. This is the minor chord that perfects the melody. And as an historian, you know that you sit and talk and you walk with people in the past. So to give you a little background on myself, I decided to step back a little bit. My husband and I have been doing some research through the news gleaners, the 40s and 50s and 60s, which are not digitized. So you need to sort of scroll through every page. And this happened to be one that struck me because it was within my lifetime. And it also had a couple of interesting holiday aspects for Frankfurt. First of all, the department store Schwartzman's, some of you may remember that, sold household textiles. But what was even more interesting about this particular article was it was adjacent to the description of the Christmas party that was held here in 1954, when everyone was asked to think back 50 years and the memories of people who had gone to the Herbert School on Fulkrad and Frankfurt Avenue to talk about their experiences. So they were kind of experiencing their holiday very much the way they were going to be doing it today. And this is a little bit about my connection with Frankfurt. I spent every Christmas dinner here on 5219 Castor Avenue from the time I was an infant until my grandmother passed away in 1971. Both of my grandparents had deep roots in Frankfurt. My grandfather's grandfather was a veteran of the 13th Pennsylvania Cavalry who came to Frankfurt in 1880, worked as a teamster. My grandfather was a lifelong member of 7-Up down the street, Seventh United Presbyterian Church. His parents were married there. My parents were married there. I was baptized there. And at the bottom left in 1919, that's a young men's group with my grandfather's second row on the far right. And he left Frankfurt for the first time, about 1919, 1920, Davenport, Iowa, studied chiropractic. He's had his office for 27 years in the Mutual Fire Insurance Building. And then in 1950, bought a row house on 1626 Harrison Street, which is the place that I remembered him being a chiropractor. My grandmother, who at the time I knew, when you see her in the 1950s picture in the top left, she was a member of the Frankfurt Women's Clubs. Her scrapbooks, my grandmother's scrapbooks for the Women's Club, are here at the Historical Society. But she was a fourth generation member in the 1922 photo here. She was secretary of the Sunday school at the Swedenborgian church. But this is something I did not know about her in her lifetime. She inspired me in many ways. Certainly I have her Christmas gene, but family history was something very important to her. I have many of the photos, but I had no idea until she passed away and I opened up the Bible that I inherited from her, that she had this connection to the Swedenborgian church. And the early church here in Frankfurt had a very, very interesting history. This particular story is too long for this evening. It will be, or is, the first chapter of my manuscript. But if any of you are members of the Historical Society of Pennsylvania, in October 2014, I did an article about this Free Will Baptist congregation here that was founded here in Frankfurt in 1817 on Hedge and Bowser, Plum, Guinea, had a bunch of different names, in 1817. And it was a very unusual compilation. It was a period of time when religion was very fluid, and it was Methodists who had embraced some of the doctrines of Swedenborg. They also believed in immersion baptism. It was a very kind of ecumenical church, but it was built, and I believe they actually chose to be in the heart of what was Frankfurt's African-American neighborhood because of the way that Thomas Boyle, you can see in this was the Constitution. They believed that they should incorporate after a couple of years, and this is from Thomas Boyle's account. So Christmas had a symbolism for the church from the very beginning. In 1820, he published an account of the growth of the church from 1817 to 1820. And the Constitution, and as you can see, the Constitution of the Free Will Baptist Church of Pennsylvania, they had a very ambitious mission, that they hoped that as a people that they could be the means of the salvation of thousands. So they had quite an ambitious program. But if you take a look at some of the names, you're going to see some of the people who were instrumental in creating this institution and supporting it over the years. Thomas Boyle was the minister. Robert Glenn was very significant here, not this early, but by the 1840s, he was the superintendent of the Oxford and Lower Dublin poorhouse. Not all the churches remain, not all the families that you can see here remain. Joseph Hallowell did. Joseph Hallowell was the grandfather of Guernsey Hallowell, whose histories of Frankfurt are still heavily cited. And Thomas Rohr, who in the 1840s established a very successful stagecoach operation at Unity and Main Street. David Simmons Rohr was his son, and he wrote extensively for the papers here at the Historical Society. Isaac C. Worrell, if you take a minute after Susan has pulled some very interesting old portraits, probably from the 1840s, of Reverend Worrell. He was just Isaac at this time. And Thomas Rowland, another name that's very common in the area, and they were all the original members of the church. But the account, the book itself, there's no existing copy, no copy's been found. But thanks to Guernsey Hallowell, he borrowed the only copy that we know existed at any time from T. Worcester Worrell's daughter Edna, who was very influential here at the Historical Society and also in founding the Flag House chapter of the DAR. And he borrowed it in 1930 and transcribed it and annotated it. And fortunately, that does exist. It's held right now by the Bryn Athyn Library. The Frankfurt Church and the Bryn Athyn Church were two very separate denominations, but it is preserved there, and thanks to Guernsey Hallowell. But what Thomas Boyle recalls at the end, before I close his account, I must observe that our church has been incorporated. The messenger, Brother Joseph Hallowell, returned from the seat of government on Christmas night last, and it was not a Sabbath that year. They were celebrating Christmas on Christmas Day, and first made his appearance in the temple while many were engaged in prayer, to the great joy of all that were present. Moving ahead a little bit, as I said, I'm reaching into my Christmas stocking, trying to find things that one of the most complex periods of time for Frankfurt, for the city of Philadelphia, and certainly for the church, was this period in 1837, which some historians have called the First Great Depression. And what struck me about this was not the Pumpkin Wars, but when I was searching the newspapers, and even though you have the advantage now of many of the old newspapers being digitized and searchable, searching for Frankfurt when, the Avenue, there's all sorts of references to Frankfurt that don't necessarily have anything to do with the neighborhood. But I came across this reference to Frankfurt against the world. And of course, I knew the legendary story about the banner that's here and that was carried by the GAR. Supposedly, the common understanding is that it refers to the number of Frankfurt men who served in the Civil War in relationship to the size of the town. But clearly, it was a slogan that was known at least a generation before that. And I think, and it certainly didn't have to do with this pumpkin dispute, because you have the Public Ledger and the Democratic Pennsylvanian kind of talking back and forth to one another. Frankfurt and many of the other industrial areas of the city, or burgeoning industrial areas of the city, were very unhappy with the fiscal policies of Andrew Jackson and his attack on the bank and his opposition to the protective tariff, which was very, very important for people in the industries here. And many of the Frankfurt men protested, marched down to Independence Square with banners with their artisans' labels on and so forth to protest what his attacks on the bank and the fact that he wouldn't support the tariff. And I believe that probably one of those banners carried that slogan, Frankfurt against the world, because clearly when the Public Ledger used that slogan here after the election of October 8, people thought when Jackson left office and Van Buren succeeded him that perhaps things would get better, that Van Buren might follow a different path. Well, he didn't. He followed the same fiscal policies. The economy was thrown into depression, and the Whigs swept the city and the county elections in the fall of 1837. And the Public Ledger, if you read the 19th century newspapers, some of the reporters, they were very slick with their satire. In fact, you'll even find that sometimes prominent people in Frankfurt, their names were used as wordplay, usually in a political bent. Many of the articles had, but the gist of this particular pumpkin war was that there were two pumpkins. There was a pumpkin that was had been discovered in Frankfurt, grown by Peter Buckius. There was another pumpkin grown by Samuel Wetherell. As you can see, Frankfurt against the world. Buckius and Colonel Wetherell both outdone. Well, they were both outdone by another Frankfortan farmer, Gardner Fulton. And in the end, the Public Ledger reporter said that Joseph Musselman, who was an agent for the Philadelphia and Trenton Railroad and owned a hotel, he was right. His hotel, it's not really shown on the map, but according to the census, he was just on the edge of the borough of Frankfurt, and his hotel was likely near the Frankfurt Bridge stop of the station for the train. But the Public Ledger reporter said that because these pumpkins had been grown in Frankfurt, they beat everyone else, and it just showed that Frankfurt deserved the legacy of Frankfurt against the world. So I found that fascinating, that this was something that Frankfurt was well known, I think, for its protests, for its working men's, the labor uprisings and so forth, that well before the Civil War. Well, once the economic depression passed, Frankfurt could get back into doing some of the projects that had been set aside. Three important ones were the construction of the public school, the construction of the Lyceum, and the construction of the new firehouse. Interestingly, all of those buildings were built on properties that were owned by Reverend Worrell, who sold those particular lots. And here before, I've put in the Christmas Carol, Dickens' Christmas Carol was not published in America until 1844, but you have two articles from, one from New Year's, just after New Year's 1841, and one in the Christmas of 1841, so a year later, promoting Frankfurt as a great place to live, basically describing Frankfurt as the perfect Dickens' Christmas Carol village before there was a Dickens' Christmas Carol. And the first ones, you can tell a reporter's looking out the window and looking down on Main Street. And what inspires him to write this article about Frankfurt being such a charming place is he sees about 40 men walking up the street carrying turkeys, as he says, they're in table order with their heads down and their feet up. And he kind of steps away from that vignette and starts to talk about other things that inspire him in Frankfurt. The great taverns with ale that's brewed right here, the moral character of the church, of the community with churches, and he mentions by name the Swedenborgians, the Hicksite and the Orthodox Quakers, and the African Methodist Church as well. And what's interesting, at the end of this, he says that his mystery is what's going on with these turkeys. And he discovers afterward that this was the holiday gift of Jeremiah Horrocks, who owned and operated the Frankfurt Dye Works on Frankfurt Creek. And what struck me was, which was may not have been known by the person that was writing the article, but Jeremiah Horrocks was a Bible Christian. The Bible Christians were a group of English people who came from Manchester. They, in fact, were Swedenborgians, but they were a particular type of Swedenborgian. They were vegetarians, and they abstained from alcohol. And their church was in Kensington. But over time, the two groups got together. So my grandmother's family, for instance, the Levers, were among the Bible Christians that left the Kensington church early in the 19th century and came here. The other article that was written was written by the Frankfurt Herald, a reporter for the Frankfurt Herald, who was writing to the main paper, the New York Herald. And what's interesting, he kind of prefaces his letter to the editor, obviously in a way that he hopes will get him into the paper. He basically makes the point that, you know, everyone loves the Herald, the New York Herald in Frankfurt. And so he got his letter published in the paper. But he talks about that, you know, now things are back on track. The public school is going up. The Lyceum is going up. And at the end, he mentions about kind of a promotion for a village fair, a Christmas village fair. And one of the things you notice in the newspaper articles for this period, there are lots and lots of advertisements for toys, games, Christmas presents, not only for individuals, but for the vendors who are operating the fairs. But the celebration of Christmas was not without controversy at this point. Really, we talk about some of the things that we recall, that we do as traditions now, as really being Victorian Christmas. Queen Victoria was married to her German husband in 1840, and that's when some of the Christmas tree and that sort of thing. Well, the two gentlemen that you see in this picture, Benjamin Barrett was a Swedenborgian minister in New York City, and James Seddon was Reverend Worrell's successor in the New Jerusalem Church in Frankfurt. And both of them, certainly the Frankfurt Church, had been celebrating Christmas since the very beginning. But that wasn't the case in many other places. And it was somewhat of a controversy whether the new church, which is what the Swedenborgians called themselves, should be celebrating Christmas the way the old church did. But Benjamin and James were one of a committee of three who decided that they were going to get together, they were going to do a report on the propriety of celebrating Christmas Day in the church. And they put together a report. And one thing I want to mention about Benjamin Barrett, he will come back to Philadelphia in the 1860s. And he will be the minister of the downtown church, which was then at Broad and Brandywine Streets. And he becomes a significant figure and has a great deal of influence on the church here in Frankfurt. He's one of the few clergymen in Philadelphia that speak out against slavery. And the Female Anti-Slavery Society in 1867 names him, Henry Furness, architect Frank Furness's father, who was the minister of the Unitarian Church downtown, and Philip Brooks, the minister of Trinity Church on Rittenhouse Square, as being the only three members of the clergy who spoke out against racial discrimination on the streetcars in Philadelphia. So he becomes a very significant figure. But in the end, they write a long report about how if the church is in an area that is not celebrating Christmas, then they should follow the community. But certainly in New York City and here in Philadelphia, people were very involved in Christmas celebrations and fairs, and they thought that it was important for their churches, particularly here in Frankfurt, which had such a musical heritage. Reverend Worrell's father, Dimas Worrell of Trinity Church, Oxford, was the choir director there, a Revolutionary War hero who later became the choir director there. Music was a huge part of what was going on here in Frankfurt. And as you can see, the very first minutes, the records of the Swedenborgian Church of Frankfurt are at the Historical Society of Pennsylvania. And in the very first minutes, they already talk about their singing program, the program that's going to, and it usually was open to the community. Some of those names will be familiar. Again, Mr. Robert Glenn, Dr. Guernsey, Dr. Henry Newell Guernsey was the first, one of the first homeopaths in Pennsylvania, but the first homeopathic physician in Frankfurt, and his office was on Main Street, Frankfurt Avenue. But interestingly, the Grinch in the committee about the propriety of observing Christmas Day was Thomas Worcester. Thomas Worcester was the president of the General Convention, the denomination, and he just didn't see any reason why their churches should celebrate Christmas Day. There was the Sabbath, you celebrated that day. What he was concerned about was that if you were to set aside Christmas Day as a day of celebration within the churches, that people might be inspired to do some things on Christmas Day that they wouldn't do on the Sabbath. And interestingly, and sort of ironically, Thomas Worcester Worrell was actually Thomas Worcester's namesake. He was named for him. But his first memories in his essay for the Historical Society of Frankfurt on Frankfurt in the 40s, and he was born in 1842, so he's remembering as a very young boy. Actually, his memories show both sides of this. That sort of dichotomy, are we going to celebrate this as a religious holiday, or for many of the operatives here in Frankfurt who worked for Samuel Pilling's bleach works or who worked for Hart's dye works, they were Englishmen. Christmas was a day off. They were mumming. They were going to the taverns. It was it was in fact a day of revelry, but of a very different sort. And Thomas Worrell remembers that the first Kris Kringle that he recalls seeing made his appearance on top of Mr. Johnny Axe's chimney. My father, Thomas Boyle Worrell, saw him and told me he was confident that old Chris would stop at our house. Sure enough, he did. And he left, among other things, a child's Bible. I have it yet. But in that same series, he recalls just exactly what Thomas Worcester was concerned about. On the lower corner of Oxford and Main Streets, there was a hotel called the California House. And in my chapter about this, I kind of go into why I think it was named the California House and where it likely was. It was frequented by Little Brittoners. And Susan's put out one of the images from the collection here about Little Britain, which was the area around Frankfurt Creek where so many of the English operatives were living. These were rough and boisterous and caused a deal of trouble on Sundays and holidays. One of the prettiest riots I ever saw started there one Christmas Day. I observed the affair from my grandfather's yard, which was, his grandfather's yard was at Sellers and Main Street, Frankfurt Avenue, which is where the property was sold for the Lyceum and so forth. I was too young to realize the danger and was quite put out when I was called into the house. So here we are on the eve of the Civil War. And this is kind of, if you were going to be Christmas shopping in Frankfurt at that period of time, what it might look to you, and how some of the, not only the shops, but there were some new venues for celebration. The Frankfurt Swedenborgian Church, for instance, used several of these venues because their Christmas programs were so well attended. And I've marked here, you can see that the Frankfurt and Southwark Railroad was only a couple of years old at this time, having opened it in January 1858. And I just wanted to read you. It was interesting because I found this article about the opening of the railroad, which when you listen to it, it's kind of a backward compliment for Frankfurt, and it's something that you might have read in the newspaper in 1922 when the L opened. The increased and cheaper facilities of locomotion will augment the desirableness of Frankfurt as a place of residence. A good deal of money, which is now spent in local stores there, may be diverted away to more ambitious parts of the town for a short time, but this will soon correct itself as stores of higher mark and note than Frankfurt now possesses will undoubtedly spring up to supply the demand. We may expect also to see the Frankfurt ladies adorning Chestnut Street, much more than before, when it really was a plague and a tiresome bother to undergo the joltings and jerkings of omnibus travel. And the perfect example probably of the high and low mark stores that he's talking about. Here's John Axe's variety store. Both John Axe and Baird's Hall are going to be below Green Street. So here's the Frankfurt, they're not, if you're riding the rail, you probably aren't even going to see John Axe's variety store. From the description that T. Worcester says about John Axe's variety store, as does David Simmons Rohrer when he talks about the 30s, and Mary Allen also describes her child in Frankfurt in the 1830s and 40s. John Axe must have been quite a character. This is where T. Worcester recalls seeing Kris Kringle for the first time on the chimney. But he is identified as a taxidermist, a pyrotechnic operator. He was a Democrat. He got himself in some fisticuffs, I found in a few articles. His wife supposedly sold hand embroidery. He was just the kind of colorful character that you can imagine children would have loved to have visited his store. But it probably wasn't quite on the scale that people who were thinking about traveling to Frankfurt may have been thinking about. Baird's Hall is just at the end of this period. William Baird was a Scotsman who had operated Aramingo mills on the other side of Frankfurt Creek. And he built a new mill just between Axe's store and Green Street in 1863. He called it Lanark Mills after Robert Owen's communitarian experiment in Scotland in the 1820s. And Baird's Hall, he designed meeting places and auditorium rooms so that he could offer those rent-free to church groups, to political organizations, to his own employees for events and so forth. What's kind of interesting about Baird's Hall is that William Baird was a member of the Presbyterian Church in Frankfurt, and he was allowed the Presbyterian Church to use his hall while they were waiting to build the church, which would be right at the corner, right next door here. What would become Seventh United Presbyterian did have a church right at the corner of what was Franklin, now Griscom, and Orthodox Street. They were only there for about a decade, and I think the church was too big for them, and they ended up down at the other end of Oxford Street. Faunce's Hotel, it was called Faunce's then. It was used for Christmas events, but this was actually the location of the founding of the Oxford Provident. It was Samuel Pilling's hotel at that time, And my great-great-grandfather, Thomas Sidebotham, was the tavern keeper. Daniel Fonts succeeded him and then bought the hotel after he died. Wright's Institute, opened in 1854, was another place where the New Jerusalem Church often had their Christmas singing celebrations. Isaac Rohrer's Toys, Mary Allen recalls, she did a whole article for the Historical Society of Frankfurt papers about Isaac and Ann Rohrer being friends of the children of the last century, that their shop had all of the delights that children of that particular era wanted. And Mary Ellen also remembered that by the first decade, when she was writing in the first decade of the 20th century, only Johnny Axe's variety store and C.C. Charles Oram, who was a Swedenborgian, Charles Oram's store, both Isaac Rohrer's toy shop and C.C. Oram's kind of were on either side of St. Mark's. The Lyceum at this point, with Oddfellows Hall, Baird's Hall, the Lyceum, which had opened in 1841, was starting to lose favor. And so by 1866, it was sold to the Mutual Fire Insurance Company. But Oddfellows Hall during the Civil War was a very important venue for entertainments. And this particular one, I felt like I hit the jackpot when I found this. These broadsides actually are online. They're part of the collection of the Library Company of Philadelphia. They're online. But this particular event kind of hit all the buttons for today's Christmas stocking talk. It was a presentation that was given on Christmas Eve in 1863. The Zographicon, and I'll tell you in a minute about what that was actually an invention of a gentleman who was living in Frankfurt at the time. And it was, the play was written by a Swedenborgian who would have a very significant influence on the Frankfurt congregation, T.S. Arthur. You'd think Christmas Eve, 10 nights in a bar room, what kind of program is that? But 10 Nights in a Barroom was T.S. Arthur's most famous novel, written in the early 1850s. T.S. Arthur was known, he came to Philadelphia in the 1840s, wrote for Godey's Lady's Book for a time, then started his own magazine, Arthur's Illustrated Home Magazine. It had various titles. But he was a moral reformer, just like B.F. Barrett. He and B.F. Barrett and the Frankfurt congregation would be very involved in moral reforms in the 1860s. And it basically was, it was a temperance play. And it was considered, he wrote stories for children as well, some about Christmas, but temperance, anti-commercialism, all of those were part of his program. And this is a picture, this is from the Library of Congress collection of T.S. Arthur. This particular broadside I thought was interesting because it shows you what the auditorium would have looked like in Oddfellows Hall. And you can see why it was so good for these projection techniques. The Zographicon was, and many of these projection techniques, these panoramas, had crazy names like this. They just sort of made them up. Well, Joseph Very was an English immigrant, and he came up with this process. And I believe he probably, he mentioned in his advertisement that he spent 18 months with an artist creating these designs, these painted panoramic designs about 10 Nights in a Barroom that would be displayed in Oddfellows Hall. Well, 10 Nights in a Barroom had played at the Continental Theater downtown for about 18 months before, and I think he managed to buy the scenery. But if any of you remember as children, perhaps putting together a panorama where you drew a bunch of pictures and then you wrap them around like a paper towel tube, and you rolled them, and one picture, and you would tell a story. Well, that's basically what this was on a gigantic scale. He was taking the scenery, and it would roll across the stage to tell the story. But he had some success with the Zographicon, but the Stereopticon was the real gem at the time. And Very would, in 1864, left Frankfurt and took his plays on the road in Ontario. But the Stereopticon, and I know Susan could probably tell you this because she's done a lot of work on the photographers here, but the technology for photographic glass plates originated here in Philadelphia with the Langenheim brothers. Magic lantern slides was a very old-fashioned technique, although originally it was hand-painted onto glass and then projected onto a screen. Once the perfection of photographic images on glass projected opened up the opportunities. And during the Civil War, people not only wanted to see pictures of foreign places that were narrated, but they also often saw images from the war that were displayed to sort of get people behind the war effort. This particular one I thought would be of interest to the Historical Society, particularly because it was to benefit the National Cornet Band, which was the group of musicians founded in Germantown that became part of the 114th, and the Cowden Drum, which was just recently restored here, belonged to one of the musicians that was part of that band. By the 1870s, believe it or not, for about a decade, there were two Swedenborgian churches here in Frankfurt because there was a very unpleasant schism, which is beyond tonight's story, but it was kind of a crazy story. They split, reflecting the schism, the denominational schism that really created the General Convention Swedenborgians here in Frankfurt and the General Church, which is reflected in Brynathen. But in the 1870s, they finally got their act together. They came back to reunited, and the Rohrers, Thomas and Elizabeth Rohrer, who had their stagecoach operation on Unity Street, sold the church property at Paul and Unity Streets, where they created a new church. There are no images that I've been able to find of the church at that time. The one I showed you at the beginning was a complete renovation of the 1870s church in 1922. But you start to see how the musical program that they have been developing for now 50 years has become a real community event. And John Major, who was a Civil War veteran, was the reporter, and he would often write in very exciting language about what was happening. And I brought these out particularly because these are people that were very involved, would be very involved in the development of the Historical Society here. Thaddeus Stern, who was an alderman and a police magistrate here in Frankfurt, was the director of the choir, and he's also the grandfather of Judge Alan Stern. Mrs. Levis, Eliza Jane Levis, was Thomas Worcester Worrell's aunt, and she was a music teacher, and they had as many as 300 people at Wright's Institute for their Christmas program that year. But as you get closer to the beginning of the new century, Christmas life in general becomes more complicated. And I thought this was an interesting Christmas season event. that was, again, another sort of Frankfurt against the world kind of event. And there was a huge protest that began in November 1895 when the Frankfurt and Southwark Railroad, which was under the management of the Union Traction Company, decided to eliminate transfers for Frankfurt passengers downtown, essentially doubling their fare. And needless to say, they were up in arms about it. And one of the biggest protests was held at this music hall. The music hall was a very short-lived building. It was built on the site of a roller skating rink called Garfield Hall in 1892. Horace Castor was the architect, but it was destroyed by fire in 1896, just a year after this protest. And the only existing photograph I was able to find was actually in the article about the fire. But basically, the protest was that the demand was that the fares had to be cut back, transfers had to be brought back, and luckily, Dr. Leek, actually, who lived in one of the oldest colonial homes in Frankfurt, which was raised in 1951, he led the meeting and basically said, well, back when the Frankfurt and Southwark Railroad was incorporated, the incorporators wrote in there that the city could purchase the railway. And so that's what they demanded. Either you cut the fares, bring back the transfers, or we're going to recommend that the city buy the railroad because it's permissible according to the railway's charter. Well, finally, through the protests, they finally back down. They say, okay, we'll give you your original fares. We'll cut the fares back. But there was already blood in the water as far as Union Traction was concerned because the employees decided to take up some of their grievances at the same time, and they weren't happy with the way the company was handling them. And right in the middle of the Christmas season, you've got a protest and a strike. And it threw the city into absolute chaos. And what's interesting, there's a huge front page article in the paper about this strike that shows how people are trying to deal with not being able to ride the railways. Here's the philosopher is using his roller skates. And here's the bicyclist. Well, he doesn't care how long it lasts. He's got his bicycle. And the Frankfurt Bicycle Club, and Susan brought out a picture and put that on the table. The Crankshaws, who were members of the Swedenborgian Church, were instrumental in creating the Frankfurt Bicycle Club in the 1880s, and it was recognized as the second oldest bicycle club in the city. So they didn't care, but here's Frankfurt coming into Frankfurt. Well, the story was that people were trying to walk home from the city and they were getting exhausted, and they would try to hitch rides with farmers in their carts who would end up charging them more than it cost them if they paid the higher fare. So, but then and interestingly, at the bicycle club at the same time was advertising its dances here in Frankfurt. But in the end, the strike ended by Christmas Eve, but the damage was done. And by the spring of the next year, the city had purchased the railway. And I'm just probably the most important person in the church related to Christmas was Edna Worrell. And she had her certificate of music from Penn. She had graduated from the normal school. This is T. Worcester's Worrell's daughter. She was one of the founders of the DAR. She was just a powerhouse. Very talented woman. She writes her first play, children's Christmas play, wins a $50 prize, the Ladies' Home Journal, for the best Christmas play. of 1902. It's published in the Ladies' Home Journal. And she, on the basis of this and some other things that she wrote, she got an editorship with Ladies' Home Journal. And she started writing a recurring series on music education. She was a music educator. And this is the beginning, of course, of the progressive era, when education is particularly important. What's the best education for children in a well-rounded education? And here's just an example of some of the things. Some of the plays that she wrote would be published in the Ladies' Home Journal and then published again by one of the more economical publishing houses for music educators. But some of these were just a riot. They tend to be rare. This pretty cover actually is from the Library of Congress. But the Toys Rebellion, basically, the youngest children played the toys. So you can see where the youngest children in the end kind of got one up on their older brothers and sisters, because the younger children are the toys. And they rebel. They say, we don't like the way we're treated by the children, which were their older brothers and sisters in many cases. So they rebel. They run away from the Christmas tree. Santa Claus comes walking down, sees this empty Christmas scene, obviously tells these children that they need to take better care of their toys. The toys come back under the tree and all is well. She kind of follows that theme, but as a good educator, brings in current events. Chris in Japan, she wrote just in the middle of the Russian-Japanese conflict, when many Americans were really very supportive of the Japanese and were interested in Japanese culture. In this case, she sends Kris Kringle to Japan. He meets the emperor. He's lost his sleigh, but he has his reindeer. So the Japanese emperor gives him his throne to use as his sleigh. Christmas at the pole, she brings in Perry and Cook to meet, who have just been to the pole, supposedly, although there was some controversy about that as well. But they meet Kris Kringle, and another whole section of Edna's plays were patriotic. And for some reason, Christmas at the Pole also included Uncle Sam and Aunt Columbia and a few other and sundry characters, but clearly something that children would have fun with. She kind of rounds those out by the end of the 20s, but I thought that these two were particularly interesting. The Little Stranger was basically sort of a Good Samaritan sort of story. A young child, poor child, at Christmas time, nobody pays any attention except, of course, for a poor family. But what she's done here is interesting technically, because at this point, you're getting into the silent movie era. And what she does, she creates a play that will actually replicate a silent movie. She teaches children how to perform totally in pantomime. And then they use a magic lantern slide to create, if you watch a silent movie and the captions. So she's put the captions on a magic lantern slide. And meanwhile, there's someone playing the piano with, suspenseful music or joyful music. And at the end, the concluding slide is dedicated to kind hearts everywhere. Well, one other thing about Edna is that during the same period of time, she is selected in the primary, Democratic primary, to run for the Recorder of Deeds for the Democratic Party, the first woman in Philadelphia to run for a row office. Now, this was a Republican machine city, so it wasn't likely that she was going to win, but she took it very seriously. And the Democratic Philadelphia Record praised her for her stamina. She was in her 50s at that point, that she was able to keep up with the younger people, and she really had a good platform. And probably her last Christmas cantata also, I think, reflects what was happening in her personal life. She was unmarried. She lived with her parents, Thomas Worcester and Nina Acadia Worrell, who was a descendant of, or grandniece of Betsy Ross. Both, they had lived in a colonial home in Tacony until Smedley Lumber Works, where the colonial home was located, wanted to expand their operation. So they had to leave that home in the early 1920s, about this time, 1921, 22. They bought a row house on Oakland Street, but both T. Worcester Worrell and Nina Worrell were gone by 1926. And Edna takes on a good friend of hers, was widowed, and then contracted a tuberculosis. And Edna takes on her 15-year-old son and raises him. And I think that's why she called this play The Little Boy Nobody Wanted. It's kind of a reversal, going from all of these plays about Kris Kringle. She goes back to the old story, which still is the case in Germany and other places, about Christkindl, the Christ child, bringing Christmas gifts. And in this case, sort of like the little stranger, the little boy that nobody wanted was finally welcomed by a poor family. So just to round it out, to close, I'm going to bring us back to where we started, which is my youth. And before I leave Edna, I want to tell you that since hopefully this will stir people to talk about maybe their memories of Christmas here, that you need to talk to Fred Prescott, because he's probably the only person sitting in this room who would have remembered. Edna Worrell remained the music director of the Swedenborgian Church, where Fred grew up until she died in 1961. So he'll have some real memories of her as a woman. I think she must have been. But I just brought in a few things that I remember from my own Christmas year. It was very common when I visited my grandparents for us to walk down to Kresge's on Frankford Avenue and pick out sticker books and paper dolls and so forth. But at Christmas time, my grandmother didn't drive, but we took public transportation. And of course, in those days, my grandmother was of the generation that you didn't go downtown if you didn't wear a hat and gloves. So it was a big event. And, riding the Rocket Express, the monorail, around Wanamaker's toy department, or going to the tea room 2 floors up, getting a vanilla snowball covered in coconut with the big tree in the center, or Uncle Whip's Toyland in Gimbels. Uncle Whip was a radio personality, and interestingly, the pastor of the Swedenborgian Church in the 1920s, another powerhouse, very progressive. He was the first minister to have a radio program in Philadelphia. It was called the Undenominational Radio Church. And it was a way of attracting people that you weren't going to bring into the doors of the church. But he broadcast on WIP, and he knew the first Uncle Whip, who was a radio personality back in the 20s. Maybe you even went to see Santa at Gimbels and had the joy of meeting that jolly old elf, like I did. Thank you. I think there's lots of goodies, so you're certainly back. Oh, absolutely. In fact, I'm sorry. Yes, were any of Edna's plays performed? Yes, absolutely. In fact, many of them were performed by the Sunday school children at the Swedenborgian Church for the greater community. She sort of tested out her ideas then. But I've also found that some of her plays, some of them, their longevity is not, quite what it might have been. You're not going to see them perform now. But I found some of them being performed in high school, or in fact, the one little clip that I had about the Christmas at the pole in the high school auditorium. Well, that was the high school auditorium somewhere in Texas. So because her plays were both of the Ladies' Home Journal plays and also the ones that were published by these Midwest publishing houses were designed to be cheap. You could buy a bunch of copies inexpensively. They were designed to be educational tools. And they absolutely, every single one of them I know was either performed by the Sunday, which I think is what inspired my grandmother to have such a love for Christmas. My grandmother was born in 1903. So she was, Edna Worrell was her Sunday school teacher. And oftentimes in the Swedenborgian magazines of the time, they would write about, Edna's new Christmas play and how well it had gone over. Literally like the one that I showed you here, 300 people came to Wright's Institute or Baird's Hall to see it performed. Thank you, and hope by the fall we're going to be going through and trying to organize some of these really interesting artifacts, and hopefully I will have a book available at that point. But thank you. Merry Christmas.
Oh, and thank you everybody for joining us. Once again, I'm Vanessa with the Historical Society of Frankfurt. I think it was a lovely presentation. Gail is a wonderful speaker, and it was a very joyful Christmas-themed lecture. So don't forget that even though Santa didn't join us online, I think he's there in person, maybe, hopefully, I don't know. You can always go to our website and you can donate. And for those donations, if you go to the purchases portion of our website, you can actually choose a book. There's a couple really good ones on there, and you can receive those as a gift for a donation. And also memberships make a really wonderful donation. Thank you once again. Happy holidays, and we hope to see you in the spring. Take care. Good evening.